It's Tuesday, February 28th, 2017. Ooh, the 28th of February. It's the last day of February for 3 out of every 4 years. It's such an interesting and exciting day. It's the only month of the year with fewer than 30 days. How about that? And we're here on 3000 NFL Mock Draft. And it's the year 3000. We're talking about the NFL Draft. No, we're talking about the 2017 draft, folks. And this week, it's the week of the NFL Scouting Combine, where we get to figure out the heights, the weights, the arm lengths, the speeds, the strength of all of the prospects in this year's NFL Draft, how it relates to the Seahawks. Indeed, we will go down that route. We'll talk about free agency, Adrian Peterson, Jamal Charles, Kirk Cousins. We'll talk about the second round of the draft and how that's sort of going to affect the first round of the draft, whether or not the Seahawks will be able to trade down if that's their, what they want to do with that pick, or if they want to trade it for a certain player or whatever it is. But there's so much that we can talk about, and we're going to squeeze it into less than an hour this week to try and get as much info as possible. And in order to do that, I need to talk a little bit less. And to do that, is my co-host Rob Staten of SeahawksDraftBlog.com. This week, or I should say last week on Field Goals, Rob posted, some of the things that the Seahawks, the things that they look for in certain players, in terms of what position they're at. And we know, according to Pete Carroll, that they're going to be looking at offensive line, cornerback, and linebacker. The Seahawks under Pete Carroll have never drafted a cornerback earlier than the fourth round. As far as defensive backs go, it's only been Earl Thomas ahead of the fourth round. So, if they need maybe some more depth at safety or a tweener player in that position, but this could be the year, with the Seahawks having 5 picks in the first 3 rounds, this could be the year that they take a cornerback almost assuredly up there. And we're going to talk to Rob about the needs that they have at cornerback and what they'll be looking for at the scouting combine. And why don't we just start there, since that's where I'm at, Rob, is the cornerbacks to be watched for this week at the scouting combine. I'm looking at it now, and defensive backs, they'll go last, meaning on Monday. So we're like a week out from finding out, the stuff that we need to know about the defensive backs. Rob, which are the, we talk at length about arm length, that is. But in terms of the other things, which are like the things that you think, if the guy's got 32-inch arms, the Seahawks then want to know if he's got this, whether it's the size, the speed, the height, or the jumping ability. What's the next best thing? And which cornerbacks are you most interested in finding out what they're going to bring to the combine this week?
Well, it's a really good class of cornerbacks. We might see 20 go before the end of day 2. So that means 20 cornerbacks in the first sort of like 90 picks of the draft, which goes to show how deep this is. I think you could even see more than 20 go. There's a lot of options here. Every type of cornerback that, whether you prefer the sort of the bigger guys, physical guys, longer guys, or whether you just want, speed and quickness and slot guys, there's everything that you've got there. As for what the Seahawks are going to look for, well, there's the measurements they do 2 days before the workout. So the big day in terms of cornerbacks is Saturday. They're going to do the measurements there. You will find the long list of measurements, and you can just go through the list and just strike off everybody who hasn't got 32-inch arms. The Seahawks have drafted, I think it's 6 cornerbacks since 2010, and every single one has had 32-inch arms. It is, when you have that consistent trend over so many years, then you know that it's something to pay attention to. So I was asked on Twitter the other day, why do the Seahawks spend so much attention on this one number, 32 inches? There is a statistic that you can, I found, which, I've not gone through since 1998 to confirm whether this is true, but the suggestion was that 100% of cornerbacks, all multiple all-pro first-team cornerbacks drafted since 1998 have had 32-inch arms. So, if every single one of multiple all-pro cornerbacks since 98 have had, we're talking a long, long time now, nearly 20 years, have had 32-inch arms, and that is a trend worth paying attention to. All of the top cornerbacks in the NFL have got 32-inch arms, except Marcus Peters, who is half an inch out. So I'm not sure that his half an inch is going to be worth, going back and sort of completely changing your mindset on this. What else are they going to look for? There isn't really anything that sort of stands out in that regard. They've taken a collection of guys who have run, decent but not great times. They've not drafted guys in the 4.3s. They've drafted cornerbacks who have run between a 4.47 and a 4.56, which is Richard Sherman, their greatest hit at cornerback. So speed isn't the most important thing. 3-cone times are pretty much, they're there or thereabouts. Richard Sherman ran a great 3-cone, but none of the others really did. Jeremy Lane had a fantastic vertical jump, 42 inches, but the rest, were kind of in the 35-inch range, so nothing spectacular there. So, what do the Seahawks look for, really? And it really just comes down to length and size. They're not going to probably draft a 5'9", 5'10" cornerback. You're looking at guys who are 5'11" and above with these 32-inch arms. That's pretty much it. So it's hard for me to sit here and say these are the guys to look for because we don't know who is going to have the length. One guy who could be really interesting, for example, is Adoree Jackson at USC, who is an amazing athlete, really great character, sensational special teams guy. The kind of player you can imagine that being of real interest to Pete Carroll and John Schneider, the type of player they've drafted in the past. But he's 5'11" and 185. And the difference between him being an option is whether he is 5'11" and 185 and whether he has got 32-inch arms. Because if he's got 29-inch arms like Cam Sutton, he's not going to be drafted by the Seahawks. If he's got 32-inch arms, then he could easily be the pick at 26, if he's even on the board. I mean, that's how much this is going to be defined here. The other point that you made there, Kenny, is that they haven't drafted a cornerback before the 4th round under Pete Carroll, which to me suggests if they're going to take one in the 1st round and, go, balls on the table, we're going to take one in the 1st round, this guy better be a freakish athlete. He must have the length, the size. He must have a fantastic 40-yard dash. He must be jumping 40 inches in the vertical. He must be having, nearly 11 feet in the broad jump. A complete workout. I think that is what it's going to take for them to take one at 26. I don't think they're going to take a middling athlete at 26 at cornerback. I think it's going to have to be a spectacular guy. But because it's a good class overall, could they take one in round 3 if he's not a fantastic athlete, if he's just got the length? Yes, I think that's distinctly possible. I can give you some names that I think are worth watching out for. Howard Wilson at Houston, terrific athlete, 6'1", 185. To look at him, he appears to have freakish length in terms of the arm length. So, he would be a guy that I would really, really focus on. I've seen a couple of clips of him high pointing the football and jumping, and it looks like he's got a great vertical leap. I think that Howard Wilson is going to be someone who's going to have a great combine and is going to really propel his stock in a way that William Jackson III did, who was another Houston cornerback a year ago. So Howard Wilson is definitely someone to keep an eye on there. Kevin King at Washington has got the size and the length, and I think his tape is really underrated. I think he's really good. You don't see him get beaten deep. He's really quick across the middle. He's played in the slot. He's played outside. I think that Kevin King is somebody, Seahawks fans are going to be watching for him anyway, but I think that he's somebody that they really, really need to keep an eye on. And then there's other guys like, Treston Deku at Oregon State, who could be a day 3 option for them, maybe. Fabian Moreau at UCLA, if he was just a quarter of an inch underneath the 32-inch arm length at the Shrine game. Let's see if on a remeasure he gets up to 32 inches. Keller Witherspoon at Colorado is another player to keep a look out. Quincy Wilson's a really interesting guy at Florida because I quite like the look of him on a second review this week. But he only ran a 4.6 at the Spark Combine in 2013. So let's see if he can run a bit quicker than that to get on Seattle's radar. But, you could run through so many different names. I would just say, look at the list on Saturday. Get a highlighter pen and highlight the guys with 32-inch arms and then watch their workouts. And then let's get together on Tuesday and sort of sift through this and see who are the names that we can really zone in on for the Seahawks. Because this 32-inch marker really is the thing to focus on.
Yeah, and Keller Witherspoon is interesting too because of, like you said, he's 6'3", 190 pounds. And if you look back at Richard Sherman's 2011 combine, he's 6'3", 195 pounds, 32-inch arm length, 38-inch vertical, 10.5 in the broad jump, 16 reps on the bench, runs a 4.56. And if you look at his NFL.com, overview, it says Sherman is a size prospect with some good intangibles that will help him mold into a contributing backup corner for a press-heavy team. However, he does not possess the natural coverage instincts, fluidity, or burst to be considered a future starter. Is comfortable and capable in press man, using his size to disrupt receivers, releases off the line, but doesn't show enough makeup speed to consistently recover when beaten. And they call him a day 3 prospect, which he was. He went in the 5th round. And I'm curious, looking at Witherspoon and looking at Sherman, 6 years after Richard Sherman has been drafted, putting aside all of the stuff going on with Richard Sherman right now in the media and how he's sort of right now, not, he's, I guess you could say, being vilified and not like a super well-liked person with Seattle media at the moment, putting aside all the other stuff with Richard Sherman, based on what we've seen, with Richard Sherman's size and length and the way that Pete Carroll has used him and to make him, arguably the best cornerback in the NFL and not a backup cornerback on a press-heavy team. And you look at and if you look at Witherspoon, if you look at Kevin King, do you think that if the exact mold of Richard Sherman, including tape, including game film, if he goes into the draft in 2017 at the 6'3", at 32-inch arms, at 195 pounds, all of those things the same, does he go way earlier than the 5th round? Does he go in the 1st round, just as a prospect because of the standard that Richard Sherman himself has set for guys like Witherspoon and King? Or is it still a matter of most guys, the majority of guys to this day, like Richard Sherman, will not do well in the NFL? There are other attributes to Sherman that make him a great player, or has he changed the game for cornerbacks entirely?
Yeah, he and the Seahawks have changed the game. So if Richard Sherman was in this draft, he would not last until the 5th round. What's happened is, teams saw the success that Seattle had, and the Seahawks set a trend. So when they could see that Richard Sherman was playing the way that he did, and Brandon Browner, and then Byron Maxwell, teams, because it's a copycat league, were looking at the type of player the Seahawks were drafting and were bringing in and were having a lot of success with. And then you saw a lot of teams try and mimic it. The New Orleans Saints have been trying to copy this approach for a long time now. Other teams have tried to do it as well. And you can see, Jacksonville kind of with Gus Bradley going there, and then the Atlanta Falcons, have been trying to do that. So for a lot of different reasons, teams have started to take guys that sort of fit the Seattle profile. It's harder for the Seahawks to find their guys, in quotes, not just at cornerback, but at many different positions on that defense. I think that we're going to see, really athletic linebackers going earlier because of Bobby Wagner. And I think length will be more important at linebacker because of KJ Wright. And, the Michael Bennett impact is going to help a lot of pass rushers. And there's lots of, and Earl Thomas, is another, any kind of safety like Malik Hooker's probably going to go in the top 10, compares very well to Earl Thomas. Buda Baker gets a lot of Earl Thomas comps, and even though Baker's probably like 5'10" and 185, maybe a little bigger than that, teams are going to be willing to take him earlier than they maybe would have been if Earl Thomas didn't exist, because they've seen the success the Seahawks have had. So yeah, those guys are going to go a lot earlier than they would have done before. The 2 players that you mentioned, Ahkello Witherspoon, watching him against Washington, it's very difficult. A lot of people underrate John Ross. They're focusing on again, this is a common problem with the media at this time of year. It focuses on things that guys can't do. They're always looking for a reason to sort of, yeah, but he's injured, or yeah, he's not quite that big, or oh, this is not quite right. John Ross is a top 20 pick. He's going to go in the top 20. He's a sensational player. He's Deshaun Jackson without any of the headaches. So you watch Ahkello Witherspoon against John Ross because you want to see how good Witherspoon is. And for me, Witherspoon did as good a job as anybody covering John Ross last season. So that's a major tick for him. You think, yes, can he do it against the kind of competition he's going to come up against in the NFL? Yes, he can, because he covered John Ross really well. The problem with Witherspoon, and this is the big difference between him and Richard Sherman, is Richard Sherman's tackling in the open field and tackling and physicality as a cornerback is A+. There is not a better tackling cornerback in the NFL. Witherspoon shows zero willingness to tackle in college. And what teams are going to have to determine here is whether or not it's just a thing where he will never have that in him. He's just not a physical guy. He just doesn't want to tackle. He wants to cover. Or whether it's just a thing that maybe it's the way that he was taught at Colorado. Is it just a technique issue that can be fixed? Does he have that kind of passion inside him and you just need someone to get it out? And if he has that, then he's going to go very early. But teams are going to be really concerned about a perceived lack of physicality and an unwillingness to tackle. And this is why I think Kevin King has the edge over him, because I think, first of all, King's going to be a better athlete. I think that a lot of people on Monday night are going to be talking about Kevin King. Like I said, I think he's one of the most underrated players in this draft class. He's going to have a sensational workout. He's got the frame. He's got the length. I think his attitude is great. He's not, he's not Howard Wilson as a tackler. Howard Wilson, who I mentioned at Houston earlier, really good tackler. I don't think he's that good, but I think that he's adequate in that regard. And I think he's got a ton of potential. He can play him outside, play him in the slot. So I think that Kevin King is going to be somebody, that teams are going to be salivating over on Monday night. And I think a lot of Seahawks fans are going to be as well. And for someone who often gets talked about, is he going to, maybe the Seahawks could get him in the second round. I think after Monday and after the combine, nobody's going to be talking about him being there for the Seahawks at the end of round 2.
That'll make a lot of Seattle people happy to if it's going to be a situation where either John Ross or Kevin King or Budda Baker wind up with the Seahawks. All makes sense in some sort of capacity, perhaps mostly Kevin King or Budda Baker, but we'll see where they sort of measure out. Another thing that would make Seahawks fans happy would be a good offensive lineman or 5. And, this year it's going to be interesting to watch what happens through free agency, because we've got a weak class of offensive linemen in the draft, and we've got a very deep class of free agent offensive linemen, and perhaps a couple guys on the trade market, just because we've seen offensive linemen, many of them get released or not have their options picked up, like Kelvin Beachum or Ryan Clady or Russell Okung, and there's going to be more that hit the market, only more and more, and I think that it's going to be even more interesting to continue to watch it, and big names that maybe have not performed well, like Chance Warmack and Jonathan Cooper, guys that were top 10 picks, and it'll just sort of be interesting to see where those guys end up and what Seattle tends to do, because I think this is a situation where, with the amount of offensive linemen out there, they might be able to get a starting caliber one without, spending a lot of money on it, which I think is something that Pete Carroll talked about, when he says, like, we're not just going to throw a bunch of money at the problem. That doesn't mean they're not going to throw some money at the problem, if it's the right fit. And I do see, as I'm going through every team's free agents, and I'm going to try and compile a full list of all the offensive linemen that are out there. And it's going to be 25 to 30 at least names that you could sort of see why they would make some sense for the Seahawks. So by getting one or two, they're going to be a less of a need for that. That being said, this Friday, when the offensive linemen, running backs, and special teams guys, but when the offensive linemen start their workouts on Friday, we'll start to see where they measure out. And Rob, as you point out, they would want them to be around 6'5", 320 pounds, 35-inch arms, no shorter than 33-inch arms, hopefully a 31-inch vertical, and plus 9-foot broad jump, plus 30 reps on the bench. And, that'll come down to your trench explosion formula that holds, a lot of truth and sort of predicting which guys will be in their range. And it'll be great to see who has that score of 3 or better after this weekend. But in terms of the offensive lineman available in the first or second round, who's a guy that you'll be really, I guess, some of these offensive linemen that you like on tape, but you'll be really disappointed if they don't measure out well, and maybe some guys that you don't love on tape, but you'd be very interested if you think they might hit some of these athletic marks that'll put them in Seattle's purview.
Well, you can pretty much list or you could count the number of offensive linemen I like in this class on one hand, really. I mean, this is the problem of the NFL. NFL has a major offensive line problem. And this is going to be the issue in free agency, I suspect, is that teams are going to look at the options in the draft and they're going to think, you know what? We have to go for, the Russell Okung, or we have to, overpay Matt Khalil or Kevin Zeitler or whoever else is going to be out there, because we're not going to find solutions in this draft class. It's a defensive draft. So free agency, I think we are going to see free agent offensive linemen getting overpaid. So I think the Seahawks are going to probably take a step back from this. And it's not what people want to hear. The Seahawks fans want to see this team aggressively pursue offensive linemen. And I don't think that's going to happen. I just, unless there's some kind of like freaky trade they come out with, maybe, they do have 3 third-round compensatory picks now, and those are tradable for the first time this year. If they can convince a team to part with an aging veteran offensive lineman who they think they can get 3 years out of for one of those third-round comp picks, then maybe that's the way to go, and maybe that's what they will do. And then they can control the salary of that player, as opposed to having to pay $10 million for someone like Ricky Wagner at Baltimore, who's not really worth that kind of money. So, and would probably make him like the 3rd highest paid player on the team, which I just cannot see happening. So to look at the draft, I love Garrett Bowles. We've talked about Garrett Bowles for weeks. It seems like, the national media now are starting to catch up with Garrett Bowles and are talking about him in the way that they should do. I suspect after the combine, a lot of people will be regarding him as a top 15 lock. I think there's every chance he will go in the top 10. You just do not see offensive tackles with his ability. I mean, his ability to get to the second level and nail, a safety or even a cornerback, in open space, to lock on. Do you know how hard it is for someone who is 300 pounds in space 1v1 to block a guy who is like 195, 200 pounds? It's almost impossible to do, and Bowles does it. I mean, the UCLA game, his second level blocking was sensational. The other thing he's got is fantastic hip torque, so he can lock on to defensive linemen at the point of attack, can turn them, just flip his hips superbly, and then drive the guy out of the play to create running lanes. I mean, that's just, it's elite level athleticism for an offensive lineman. His kick slide's good. He plays with a nasty demeanor. He's got the attitude that teams will love. I see very few flaws with Garrett Bowles. With just absolutely sensational offensive tackle prospects. Going to go very, very early. Ryan Ramchik's not going to work out at the combine, so we're not going to find out much about him other than size measurements. Presumably he's going to be there to go through that. Not a fan of Cam Robinson. The Seahawks have been there, done that, got 3 different t-shirts with James Carpenter having to go from tackle to guard, and then Justin Britt having to go from tackle to guard, and now Jermaine Ifedi's gone from tackle to guard. Let's not go down that road again. Cam Robinson's probably going to play guard. Looks a bit like DJ Fluker to me, who ended up playing guard for San Diego. I don't think the Seahawks want to go down that road again. And then you've got guys like, Forrest Lamp. There's a lot to like about Forrest Lamp. Probably going to have a good combine. He's got 31-inch arms and he's a guard. The Seahawks going to spend another first-round pick on a guard. Is replacing Mark Glowinski really the priority this year? No, it's not. It's the tackle position. So after that, I think the only thing you can kind of hope for is that Dorian Johnson, who is the Pittsburgh offensive lineman, who I do like. I think that he has got the size, 6'5", 315, was recruited as a tackle and was a 5-star recruit at tackle for Pittsburgh, and they put him inside to left guard. If he's got the length and he's got the athleticism, maybe he could be like a Brandon Albert style player. People remember 2008, I think it was, that Albert was drafted. He's the guy who's just been traded from Miami to Jacksonville. He was a left guard at Virginia, but then moved to tackle when he was drafted. So I think by Kansas City he was drafted, I think. So they moved him out to tackle from guard. So could the same happen for Dorian Johnson there? And could he be on the radar? Possibly. Could Antonio Garcia have added weight? It's wishful thinking. Taylor Moton, who's from Western Michigan, looks like a Seahawks type of offensive lineman. Could be someone they target maybe in the 2nd or 3rd round. Roderick Johnson has got the size of a left tackle, but just really underwhelmed at Florida State for a couple of years. So I don't think he's going to be an early pick, but he's someone with potential to play tackle. Apart from that, maybe Chad Wheeler can have a good combine. Maybe Jermaine Illumina, who's from England. So I hope that he has a good combine. Maybe he's somebody that they could look at. David Sharp at Florida, be interesting to see how he gets on. But beyond that, Kenny, it's going to be really hard, whether it's free agency or the draft, for the Seahawks to find solutions here. And again, as I mentioned, it's not what the fans want to hear. They want to see aggressive improvements to this offensive line, I would say if you're a Seahawks fan, prepare for some second and third level or second or third wave free agent signings, because there are not going to be many solutions in either free agency or the draft.
Well, yeah, and they're not going to want to hear this either, but the 2013 Seahawks offensive line that helped, pave the way for a Super Bowl championship was not 5 big name free agent signings. And other than Russell Okung, was not, 5 high draft picks. The whole point of that team was, they drafted and they spent a first round pick on Okung in 2010, a first round pick on James Carpenter in 2011. And then they built J.R. Sweezy from a 7th round conversion to the right guard position. They got Breno Giacomini in the same sort of way that they got a guy like Bradley Sowell or Gary Gilliam. And Max Unger obviously was, a 2nd round pick, but so is Justin Britt. And it was same thing as Max Unger was playing guard before they moved him over to center. He played center before, but they moved him. They're building the exact same way, other than the fact that they don't have a top 5 pick, top 6 pick, if you want to get technical with Okung. Other than that, they're doing it the exact same way. So what are they going to do? They're going to go into 2017 with at least 4 of the same starters from last year. I guarantee you that. I really feel strongly that it's going to be Britt at center and Afidi at right guard and Glowinski at left guard. And probably, they're probably going to, obviously they're going to push in something to not, allow themselves, they're not going to force themselves to be forced to use George Fant at left tackle. They'll bring in some other people, but they are content with saying, we believe that cohesion and growing together and chemistry is more important on the offensive line than, spending, $30 million on it. Yes, it's kind of ridiculous that they're spending $6 million on their entire starting offensive line. But that's what they're going to do. And, fans are going to freak out. But the truth of the matter is, the 2017 offensive line is pretty much going to be at the same position that the 2012 offensive line was in. They're giving it time. And that's what Pete Carroll believes in. And that's, you can disagree. And I might even agree with you to disagree with him, but that's what's going to happen. The only thing I could see would be maybe they do spend $5 million on a right tackle for one season. If they might do something where it's like, I could see them giving, Matt Khalil the same sort of deal that, Okung and Beachum got last year, which is 1 year with an option, because Khalil was a Pete Carroll recruit at USC. He's at his lowest point right now in value. There's a good chance, coming off of a season in which he missed 14 games, it's a good chance that he's going to have to sign a 1-year deal. And maybe that's something to give him an opportunity to do that. And maybe he doesn't even win the job over George Fant. But I really think that they are fans who think, well, they got to sign up a bunch of guys. Well, that's not what they did with their previous good offensive line. So I don't think that they're going to start changing that philosophy. They're going to, I believe with the extra money that they have to maybe bring in 1 or 2 big names, they're going to go for a wide receiver or a defensive lineman, and maybe a cornerback because of their need there. But looking at the cornerback class in the draft, I think it's a better chance that they'll draft one and, hope, and go with, Jeremy Lane and DeAndre Elliott and, a rookie and maybe a veteran and work that out that way. But I agree with you, Rob, that fans are not going to be happy with the offensive line. And also just like to wrap up on the combine, I want to ask you about, so we've got Friday offensive line running backs, Saturday quarterbacks, receivers, tight ends, Sunday defensive linemen and linebackers, Monday defensive backs. I want to know, because we've heard a lot about, there's talk about John Ross and if he'll run in the early 4.2s, the low 4.2s. There's talk about Obi Melifonwu and whether or not he might have one of the best combines of all time. We've had things in the past where it's like the fastest 40, or, Byron Jones breaking the world broad jump record at the combine, the most reps. What's the position and, what's like the position and workout that is like your favorite moment of the combine to pay attention to, and what is your sort of thoughts on that for this season with these group of guys?
Well, I love the explosive testing. I love to find out what the vertical and the broad jump numbers are, because I think you can learn more about, how good an athlete is through those, rather than just watching them necessarily run in a straight line. When this was the great thing about last year, was that Jermaine Afediat, he looked like the Incredible Hulk when he was out, doing the drills and stuff like that. And then he jumps a 32-inch vertical at his incredible size. And you think his 32-inch vertical was more impressive than the little guys doing a 40-inch vertical. I mean, it was just incredible. And I just loved that, who are the most explosive athletes at the combine? That's what I'm looking for. Not who's the fastest guys, who are the most explosive. So for me, it's the vertical and the broad. I just want to finish off with a couple of, just one quick point on the offensive line, and then just a couple of other quick points on the combine. I've just given like a really sort of doom and gloom scenario there. Look, you're going to be disappointed, Seahawks fans. I think it's important to say with this sort of little thing here, there's a chance Ryan Ramczyk will be there at 26. I mean, it's not impossible. He's good. He's got a torn labrum. He's not going to do any workouts or drills before the draft. And there's a chance that he'll go in the top 20, because everybody's looking for offensive linemen, and Denver at 20, and they've just released Russell Okung. They're going to have to find a solution there. There are going to be teams that need offensive linemen, and if Garrett Bowles goes very early, then admittedly there's a good chance that Ryan Ramczyk will too. However, the injury situation, the fact he only played 1 year at Wisconsin, the fact that nobody's going to really know how good a tester he is, could just allow him to drop into sort of that 26 range, maybe. And the other thing to consider is, if the Seahawks think that Ryan Ramczyk is a really good player, well, now they've got 3 third-round picks, 2 compensatory picks. So if they wanted to move up, 3 or 4 spots to get him using one of those, and felt like this is going to be the answer to our problems on the offensive line, we get this guy who can try him at left and right tackle, he's going to fill one of those spots for years to come, then they could go after him. So, it's not completely sold that they're not going to be able to find an option in early in the draft. Ramczyk could be there. I don't think Bowles will be. I think any mock draft that has Garrett Bowles even falling close to Seattle's pick is way off, and he's going to be in the top 15. And as for the combine overall, when you mentioned some of the names there that are going to have a really good time, I think that Justin Evans, his tape is pretty awful at times. He misses too many tackles. He too often goes to the big hit and whiffs and stuff like that. But I think he's going to have an amazing combine at safety. He's the Texas A&M safety. I think the safety class and the safety and the cornerback day on Monday is going to be incredible to watch that and see who performs the best and who can maybe, have some of that freaky athleticism that Seahawks look for. I'm going to be really interested to see Shalom Luani work out from Washington State. I think that he could easily be an option for the Seahawks, and they might take him a lot earlier than some other teams as well. I just really can't wait to see Luani work out. Was glad that he got invited. I think the linebackers are going to be fascinating. It's a shame that Jared Davis isn't going to be there. We know the Seahawks want a linebacker. Pete Carroll spelled it out. He said, we need to draft a linebacker in his end of season press conference. They cannot have Bobby Wagner and KJ Wright doing near enough 100% of the snaps. I mean, 100% of every defensive snap. Bobby Wagner was something like 0.5% from doing 100%, and KJ Wright was like 98%. They can't have that next year. They've got to have some depth there. They've got to have a guy who can spell them, can play the Sam. If they want to play a 4-2-5, they've got to have somebody where they can take Wagner and Wright off the field and give them a bit of a breather. It might be that they considerably lower their snaps to sort of more like 80-90%, which is where the likes of Cliff Averill are at for the season. That is going to extend their careers. And if you want Bobby Wagner and KJ Wright burned out in the next 2 years, then keep going. If you want to have these guys for 5 or 6 more years, then you're going to have to draft a linebacker. And, Hassan Reddick, a player we've talked about an awful lot, is he going to have the kind of combine that everybody expects? If he does, he probably isn't going to be there at number 26. But what's Zach Cunningham going to do? What's Tyus Bowser going to do? What's Alex Anzalone going to do at this combine? They're sort of players that I'm going to be keeping an eye on there. And then at running back, it's who can fit the size and the explosion that the Seahawks have looked for. The Seahawks haven't drafted really fast running backs. What they've drafted is really explosive running backs who are generally 220 pounds, about 5'10", 5'11", 6 foot, that kind of range. 220, run maybe like a 4.5, but have, great vertical, great broad jump. They want tough, powerful, explosive running backs. That's what they're looking for. They're not looking for the 200-pound 4.3 runner necessarily. So, it's going to be great. I love the combine, Kenny. I think it's fantastic. You're just taking all of this information, then you spend like 2 weeks processing it all. You have free agency thrown into the mix, and then you just have nothing for like 2 or 3 weeks before the draft. So, it's such a great week. We're going to find so much information out. I think this is the most exciting draft class we've had probably since 2011. I think you're going to get stars at the top. You've got depth all the way through to round 3. It's a great year for the Seahawks to have 5 picks in the first 3 rounds. They've got a chance here, the Seahawks, with these cluster of picks they've got, to really help set themselves up on defense for the foreseeable future. They can draft guys who can be part of the next great core of this defense. That's going to be the key for this draft for Seattle for me. I know people want to focus. I know the media want to focus on the offensive line. I know people like Mike Mayock want to talk about the offensive line. I know that that's the obsession with fans. I know that it's maybe the biggest need in Seattle, but this draft is a defensive draft. And if they can get a great safety out of it, very possible. A great cornerback out of it, very possible. A great linebacker out of it, very possible. Then they can start to sort of really get this team, this defense, back to where it can be. Maybe took a step back last year. 3 impact players on defense is not improbable, and 3 core players for the long-term future of this team to go with, guys like Frank Clark, for example, and Wagner and KJ Wright. That's got to be the key. And I think that is what they're going to do and what they can do in this draft class.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I couldn't think, unless, the way that you've talked about Garrett Bowles and, and talked about if Ryan Ramczyk was there and whatnot, unless one of those guys, was there, and maybe Forrest Lamp. But again, like you talked about, not having, that interest in, that much of a need of a guard. But just, it's interesting to me how many fans want to use that pick on an offensive lineman, given the amount of, just sort of disgust that they've had with James Carpenter, and how disappointed they are in Jermaine Ifedi, and just how much the pick for Justin Britt didn't work out for so long, and John Moffitt was so terrible, to the fact that at some point people are going to, I would hope people come to terms with the fact that at 26 you're not getting a very likely good offensive lineman. You got just as much value out of J.R. Sweezy, a 7th round DL conversion, as you did from James Carpenter, a 1st round pick that was supposed to be a high end right tackle and ended up being a middling right guard. So you're going to get so much more value seemingly out of Hassan Reddick or Obi Melifonwu or, John Ross or, someone of note. Even Christian McCaffrey, I would definitely be more interested in than a, Cam Robinson. So, I may not be the best. I'm not a scout. I'm definitely not a draft expert. I don't watch as much college football as the average college football fan, but just looking at it from an outsider's perspective, how could anyone be sitting here as a Seahawks fan thinking, God, I hope we take an offensive lineman? Just use the examples of them not doing that well in Seattle and think about the how much more they could get out of, a certain type of player. And maybe it doesn't always work out. Paul Richardson, the more exciting players aren't necessarily the ones that work out, but given that they can trade comp picks this season, it could make a difference. I want to, move forward. We've got a few more notes here before, we can get out of here and shut down the podcast for this week. I can't wait to come back next week after the combine drills and talk about what's happened. So just looking ahead to the draft a little bit, given what we know about the, because we'll get more honed in on certain players, but in terms of the positions in the classes, we pretty much have a good idea of what's going to be a strength and not a strength at different positions. And I think that the 2nd round of the NFL draft can often be just as important as the 1st round of the NFL draft, especially when it comes to what teams will feel comfortable waiting on at the top of the first round or the middle of the first round, looking at, well, look, I'm not going to reach for a defensive lineman maybe here because I think there's going to be a good one in the second round, or other positions of note. So Rob, when you look at the second round of the NFL draft, what are the positions that are so strong for that second round that you think it may sort of shape how these teams in the top 10 will look at their draft? Because obviously, with the quarterbacks, it's always the most talked about thing every year. We know that there's 4 quarterbacks who could go in the first round this year, maybe 4 quarterbacks that go in the top 15. And so with that, we can look at the San Francisco 49ers or the Chicago Bears or some of these other teams, the New York Jets, and we can ask ourselves, the Cleveland Browns and the Buffalo Bills, we can ask ourselves, it may be difficult for any of these teams to pass on a quarterback in the first round, knowing that Pat Mahomes or whoever the 4th quarterback isn't going to get out of the first round entirely. So what are the positions in the second round that you think are strongest, and what are the ones how it'll affect these teams at the top of the first round as it relates to what they think they can get later on?
Well, I think it's going to be very similar to what we're kind of seeing in the first round, to be honest. I mean, I think we'll see a lot of cornerbacks going from probably, sort of the mid-20s. I think we're going to see that. We're going to see an early wave on cornerbacks, and that's going to be when the likes of Sidney Jones goes very early. Marshawn Lattimore at Ohio State's going to go very early. Marlon Humphrey at Alabama will go. Tre'Davious White at LSU will go. And then I think we may just have like a pause where we maybe have sort of 8 picks where we don't see a cornerback maybe. And then we're going to see the second wave. And that's when, the Gareon Conley's going to go off the board probably at the end of the first round, and Adoree Jackson will go, and Quincy Wilson will go. And that's going to, for me, continue into the first part of the second round. If Jalen Tabor, or Tease Tabor as he's known now, goes, might go sort of early second. That's kind of be the range when Kevin King might come off the board. Rasul Douglas at West Virginia, Cordae Tankersley, Chidobe Awuzie at Colorado, Fabian Moreau at UCLA. Maybe even Howard Wilson can get into that conversation as well. That's kind of the position I think that's going to be sort of prominent at the top of the second round. I think we're going to see a lot of linebackers going in that range as well. The linebacker is going to be really interesting because you could see I could easily imagine Zach Cunningham going in the top 25, whether that's something like Washington at 17 or, Miami at 22 or New York at 23. Could definitely see that. But could also see Zach Cunningham lasting till, maybe the late 30s, early 40s. Same with Jared Davis. It wouldn't be a shock at all if Jared Davis went in the top 20. It wouldn't be a shock if he was a top 45 pick instead. Hassan Reddick's another one. I think he's really, really good. I think he's going to go in the first round. I think he probably goes off the ball before Seattle picks. But, this is a guy who played edge rusher at Temple, really. And, you're transitioning him maybe to a Mike or a Will, then teams might think, yep, really like him, but he's a project. And, I can get this cornerback, for example, who we can hopefully plug in, and they might go in that direction instead. So, I think they're kind of the positions that I would look at. Safety's another one. I think there's going to be loads of safeties that are going to be around. Obi Melifonwu we've talked about. Where's Jabril Peppers going to go? Marcus Williams at Utah. Marcus May at Florida. Maybe even Luani can get into that second round talk. I mean, we saw the rise that Deion Buchanan had, former Washington State guy. I think there's a chance that Luani could have a similar rise as well. So, that's what I would say. I think that the quarterbacks, there seems to be a lot of sentiment at the moment that the quarterbacks are going to go early. So Deshaun Watson, having been picked apart by so many people, I think he's probably going to end up looking very likely like he's going to be a top 10 pick. Mitch Trubisky likewise. And whether that's teams in the top 10 or whether teams trading to the top 10. Then Deshaun Kaiser and Patrick Mahomes, I think that the buzz around Mahomes seems to be growing and growing and growing. So I think that he could go a lot earlier than people realize, maybe even like the top 15. And I think Deshaun Kaiser will have teams sort of looking at him and saying, do you know what? There's enough tools and character to work with there that we can take a shot on this guy. And, you're looking at teams like Arizona, who are going to need an answer after this year, because it certainly looks like Carson Palmer's going to retire at the end of the season. This is the time for them to draft a young quarterback, and if they don't get at the top 4, then you're looking at nobody. So I think there's a pretty good chance that Arizona could even trade up into the top 10 to go and get the quarterback. So I think when you're looking at teams like San Francisco, Cleveland at the top of the second round, and Chicago and stuff like that, if they haven't taken a quarterback in the top 10, I'm not convinced that trading into the late first is going to be a solution for them. I think that they're going to have to look in free agency and look at what options they've got there. Or maybe wait another year, which might be acceptable for San Francisco, but it is not going to be acceptable for a team like Chicago. So what those teams do in the end is probably just take the best player available. And I think that, the positions I've talked about, their cornerback, linebacker, safety, from 25 to 35, that is where the strength is.
Just before we wrap up, I think there's a lot of good free agency news out there, and the stuff will affect the combine, obviously. Just announced in the last 5 minutes that the Jets have released Darrelle Revis. So he's released 2 years after signing, I think, a 5-year deal, facing some felony charges there. The Seahawks obviously looking for a cornerback, but Revis, not having his best season. And I think any team out there would sort of like to see what happens with the felony charges being brought against Revis for a fight against 2 people recently. Also today, the Minnesota Vikings released Adrian Peterson. The Chiefs released Jamal Charles. And so the free agent market with some of these huge name releases certainly becomes more interesting, but players in the twilights of their careers. With any of that news, Adrian Peterson, Jamal Charles, Darrelle Revis, how do you think that affects the market? Does it have any sort of effect on the NFC West, Rob?
Possibly, because, there's going to be teams going through pretty big rebuilds. The Rams have got a new head coach and need to fill out some spots on their roster. So, they could look at some of these guys. San Francisco are basically starting from scratch. So they're going to be looking around at some of these guys, I would imagine. Arizona actually, surprisingly, have done a bad job with their cap. I know a lot of people love to praise Steve Keim and Bruce Arians, but when you look at their cap situation, they are going to lose pretty much, I think, like half their defensive starters this year, because they've franchised Chandler Jones. They do not have the money, it seems, to keep Calais Campbell. Maybe they'll find a way to do that. There's Jefferson, the safety. There's Minter, the linebacker. There's others as well. It's going to be really difficult for them. So they're going to be probably looking at some of these veterans too. None of the names really interest me that much. Like if the Seahawks signed Jamal Charles, I wouldn't be against it, but I just don't think it's particularly likely. Same with Adrian Peterson. He seems to be naming the teams that he wants to play for quite a lot, and he never mentions the Seahawks. And I think he wants to go to a big market. I think he wants to go to a team that has maybe got a pretty established defensive line that he can run behind and feel good about, and that's not Seattle right now. And Seattle did not run the ball particularly well last year. They were in the bottom third of running the running game, so not particularly interested there. It's a free agency class where I think the second level guys are going to get overpaid again this year. Teams have got more cap than they ever have. Teams like Cleveland and San Francisco have got like $100 million to spend. Earl Mitchell signing last week was telling, because even the Seahawks were interested in him, possibly offered him like $2.5–3 million a year, maybe. And San Francisco signed him for $5.5 million. Miami cut him because they didn't want to pay him $4 million, and San Francisco signed him for $5.5 million. And that's the kind of thing that's going to happen here. And what you're going to find is that the Seahawks are going to probably look at guys or meet with guys and are just going to balk at the price, because they have never overpaid for bad players. And I think what they will do is they will look for value. And if someone like Jabal Sheard, for example, who's an edge rusher in New England, if he was available at a decent price, then he would be somebody you could say you can get some value there. If someone like Connor Barwin was cut in Philadelphia, is he somebody who could provide some veteran experience and some value? Yeah, I think he could be. That's a player that I would look at. But what I think we will see is that Calais Campbell, I know a lot of Seahawks fans want him. I think he's going to get paid obscene amounts of money. maybe $14 million a year, something like that. And then I think that a lot of the second level guys are going to get a lot of money. And it's not, again, perhaps not what Seahawks fans want to hear, but they might be looking at who is there in the second and third wave that can provide value, as opposed to who can they throw a load of money at to make the fans feel better about themselves. And the other thing to remember here is, they are probably going to want to try and get a deal done with Cam Chancellor at some point. So they need some money there. And any cap that they don't spend this year, they can roll over into next year. So let's say that they had $15 million of cap room free at the end of the year, not spent. Well, if they rolled that over to next year, it might help them keep someone like Frank Clark, because if pass rushers at the moment are getting $17 million a year, if Frank Clark has another 10 sack season next year, he's going to be in that kind of ballpark. So you're going to need to start saving some cap if you want to pay him and your Bennetts and your Avils and your Shermans and your Thomases and your Chancellors and your Wagners and your Wrights. So the Seahawks need to start planning ahead for stuff like that. Guys like Frank Clark will get paid on their current trajectory, and they will not want to lose players like that. So that's another thing to consider here.
And speaking of some of these defensive linemen, Eric Edholm of Yahoo reports that the Seahawks and Falcons are interested in defensive tackle Terrell McClain. McClain was a third-round pick with the Panthers in 2011. He was placed on IR towards the end of his rookie season, released in 2012, played for 2 teams that season, then was released and became a free agent, signed with the Cowboys in 2014. He's had injuries in his past, but he played in 15 games last year for the Cowboys, registering 2.5 sacks, and seems to be a very solid run defender. At the draft, he had 32, or in the combine, he had 32 and 3/4 inch arms, 300 pounds, 6'2", 29 reps on the bench, 28-inch vertical. Any sort of thoughts on Terrell McClain, and also on Russell Okung, who reportedly is open to a return to Seattle? Any interest in, we've talked about free agent offensive linemen, but any interest in bringing Okung back?
Well, on McClain, I can imagine the Seahawks being interested in him. I did another podcast with the UK Seahawks this week, and we were talking about free agency, and I said that McClain is a name to watch because he had a really good year. He's kind of that rotation guy. He's not sort of the big name, explosive interior pass rusher, but he's a guy you can put into a rotation, very disciplined, can make plays. Possibly isn't. I think he made something like $1 million this, last season. So, he's not a kind of guy who's maybe going to get 8-9 million. He's maybe a guy that gets 3-4 million, which is more in Seattle's kind of ballpark for defensive tackles. So it's a position they've never overpaid. They did what they had to keep Red Bryant, and that's basically it. And they paid Brandon Mebane, but that was a time when that team was rebuilding in 2011 when they made those deals. They needed to keep guys together. They have not spent big on that position since. So, Terrell McClain, someone certainly I would expect them to look at. Russell Okung, I guess a player that a lot of Seahawks fans would be happy to see back because he's a safe pair of hands. That he knows the scheme, the team knows him. You presume he's kind of those players. He's a name, so Seahawks fans can go to sleep a little easier thinking, well, we've got Russell Okung, he can play left tackle, and let George Fant play right tackle. But the thing to remember here is that when Okung was released, Denver fans were celebrating. They were happy that he was going. And this is a team that has no answer at left tackle. They were happy to see Okung go to replace him. So that's one thing. The second thing is he's old. He regularly got hurt. He's older now. He regularly got hurt in Seattle and missed considerable time. I think one of the main reasons he perhaps wanted to move on and see other options in free agency was because he was open to going to a more pass-friendly offense where the wear and tear was not quite the same as it is in Seattle. And, that could be an issue for him coming back here. And I've no doubt if the Seahawks were willing to pay him kind of big money that he would come back. But I think that someone out there who is absolutely desperate at left tackle will pay Okung an amount of money that will be beyond the Seahawks. And I don't think they're particularly interested in going back. I know they did it with Chris Clemens and Brandon Browner this year, but they were like veteran minimum deals. I don't think they're going to be overly interested in taking a step backwards, going back to the past. I think they've made some kind of commitment to sort of at least giving George Fant a chance to sort of own this position for the foreseeable future. And it's maybe right tackle that is more of the issue there. With Gary Gilliam being in and out of the lineup, can you really trust him? Do you want a bit more competition there? Odiambo might provide competition for Fant at left tackle. So, I'm not totally sold on Russell Okung, but I think Terrell McLean makes a ton of sense.
Last little, I think, thing to just talk about this week, because it could very well change by the next time we come on the podcast, though I don't imagine it'll happen that quickly. Especially, I think these teams are going to find out what they have in the draft this year with the quarterback class. But since it's just it's a topic du jour, and it could certainly affect the NFC West. Lots of stuff coming, with more and more players getting tagged, and the tag deadline coming on Wednesday. Kirk Cousins is getting tagged, but just because the Washington Redskins are going to, give him the exclusive franchise tag, it doesn't mean he's going to play for Washington next year, as they'll explore the trade options. And a lot of rumors going around, one that Kirk Cousins would only accept a trade to the 49ers, others that Kirk Cousins is open to playing for the Cleveland Browns. Chase and Cole of Bleacher Report saying he's not afraid to play in Cleveland, and he believes that the Browns can turn it around quickly. There's no evidence of that ever happening. But anyway, that, Kirk Cousins could be traded to 49ers to reunite with his old offensive coordinator, Kyle Shanahan, or the Browns, who could, either the 49ers or Browns could give Cousins a giant contract. I don't think that would be smart, but I don't care if the 49ers do something that's not smart. I am all for that. And I don't see Washington, biting the bullet on giving Cousins the contract he wants. Hence, why would they be going through all of this? They would just sign him at this point. So I think it's very possible that Cousins will get traded. Any thoughts on, the danger of Kirk Cousins on the 49ers, or, even on Washington, certainly an up and coming team with Scott McLaughlin running that team, formerly of Seattle and San Francisco. Any sort of thoughts on Kirk Cousins, and what would be the smart move for Washington, or the worst move for San Francisco? What do you see? What are your most what's most interesting to you with the whole Kirk Cousins situation?
Well, if Washington actually did make a smart move on the Kirk Cousins situation, it'd be the first time that they have. Charles Robinson, who writes for Yahoo, did a really good piece on this. And he kind of highlighted what an absolute disaster zone Washington has been on this whole situation. That if they'd have been willing to pay Kirk Cousins $20 million a year ago, which is, in the post Brock Osweiler and what we're going to see with future quarterback contracts coming up, it would have been a fairly reasonable contract for a quarterback who has done what Kirk Cousins has done. And a lot of the guarantee, because of the way they could have structured the deal on this $20 million a year contract, a lot of the guarantees would have been out of the way after the 2017 season. So at the end of the upcoming season, if they wanted to move on, then they pretty much could have done that without any real, cap issues there. They could have traded him or cut him, for example, and that would have been that. Now they've handcuffed their situation. I mean, they are absolutely desperate, because here's the situation for Washington. Next year, that's presuming that he's still in Washington. Next year, he will either earn $34 million for the 2018 season, because they'll have to franchise him again, which is not going to happen. They're not going to pay Kirk Cousins $34 million for one season. Or they let him walk in free agency and they just get a third-round comp pick. So I know that there was a report by Ian Rappaport saying that Washington is not going to trade this guy. Well, what alternative have they got unless they want to lose him for a third-round pick in the future? So they don't seem to want to pay him. So that's clearly not going to change unless they're going to willing to pay him $25 million a year now. Then, I think their offer was something like $12 million a year ago, which is pathetic. So they kind of have to trade him. They kind of have to look at what they can get. And a lot of the talk now is, well, if they get an incredible offer and if they get a Robert Griffin III style offer, well, that's not going to happen. So I think what we're going to see is that Washington will see what they can get for him. They will find that there's probably only San Francisco interested, and then they will try and get the best deal that they can. And San Francisco will know that they do not have a lot of options here, and they will play this pretty much, they'll play it to their tune. Now, whether or not that ends up, I can't imagine the Niners really wanting to spend the second overall pick on Kirk Cousins. They might be able to come up with a deal whereby they offer to pay a couple of second rounders maybe, or a conditional pick next year, which could be a first if the Niners are picking in this range, and a second if they're picking in this range, for example. But Washington have really screwed themselves here because they don't have an alternative. They have to deal him, otherwise they're just going to get a third round pick from him in 2 years time, because they're not going to pay him big money. He doesn't seem to want to stay there, and in a year's time Washington either has to let him hit free agency or pay him $34 million to franchise him for a third time again, which is just not going to happen. So it's a terrible, terrible situation. I think the Niners will probably benefit from this, and will probably end up getting Kirk Cousins either as a free agent next year, or will get him for a pretty cheap deal. And I don't think anybody would argue that Kirk Cousins is an amazing quarterback, or somebody that you feel really comfortable building a franchise around, that he's going to get you over the hurdle or get you to a Super Bowl. But what he is better than maybe like 18 other quarterbacks in the league, and that's better. You might as well have that as opposed to Brock Osweiler. I do think that if with San Francisco having all this cap room at the moment, if they end up paying him $20 million a year or $25 million a year, the headline might be, oh my God, they're paying him that much. What a ridiculous decision by the 49ers. But you kind of think, well, they have to pay somebody. They have to give money to somebody because they're $100 million under the cap, and they're going to get fined or get penalized for not beating the threshold. So might as well spend that money on a quarterback. So they can front load the deal so that most of the cap space and most of the guarantees come off in the first couple of years. So I actually think that this is probably going to work out for the Niners, that they probably will get Kirk Cousins at some point, and it probably will be a good move for them. And Washington are just going to be left like they always are, in a complete mess, with an owner that doesn't really seem to know what he's doing, with Bruce Allen, who appears to be meddling with Scott McLuhan, and all the talk that he maybe is he's had some well-publicized issues with alcohol in the past, and Chris Cooley was on his radio show. He's employed by the team, and he's on a radio show talking about that in public, which is not a good sign, which suggests that the writing's on the wall from McLuhan in Washington. It's just an absolute mess.
The Washington situation is its own thing. I think they can come out of this better. I think that they can still come out of this, release the $24 million that they are supposed to pay Kirk Cousins if he signs the franchise tag and plays on that. So get rid of that $24 million and open it up for some other player. Get maybe get a future first round pick out of it if you can. Maybe get a second round pick this year with that. Get that going on and start to sort of, use the pieces that you've built so far, the young pieces, and get better, get that future offensive players going on for them. Because, Trent Williams and Brandon Scherf, they've got those guys are young enough that they can still be, a core of that offensive line for a while. Jamison Crowder is a very good receiver, and you can start to build that. I really think that Kirk Cousins, I've been saying it for, the last 2 years, he is going to fall off of a cliff. And you look at the situation. If he goes to San Francisco, Kirk Cousins will be terrible. And it's not his fault. He's a fine quarterback. Capital F, fine. Nothing special. And you look at the Washington Redskins last season, Jay Gruden, has done wonders with quarterbacks, and I think has done better for quarterbacks than they are worthy of, being better. Kyle Shanahan, when he was the offense coordinator in Washington, every time Kirk Cousins took the field, he looked awful. And so, when Shanahan was there, you could say, then people talk about the reunion. Why would you want that reunion? It was terrible when it worked out. And Kyle Shanahan's, entire track record with quarterbacks has been predicated on this one season with Matt Ryan, and everybody sort of glosses over that he couldn't do anything with Johnny Manziel, that that they had a disaster with Robert Griffin III, and that his time with Houston, he got one good season out of Matt Schaub and nothing else, and sort of a lot of the players got better after he left. The offensive coordinator for Washington last year, Sean McVay, is considered one of the brightest offensive minds, a phenom, the new head coach of the Rams, an absolute phenom at offensive coordinator. Matt Cavanaugh, the quarterback's coach, who's been promoted to offensive coordinator, is 60 years old, and if you look back at some of the quarterbacks, he's a longtime quarterbacks coach, has been offensive coordinator before. And if you look at some of the guys that he's coached, people have tried to make him into, this quarterback guru, but in recent history, he was with the Chicago Bears, didn't get anything out of Jay Cutler, not enough. And when he was paired with Mark Sanchez in 2009, you thought there was something going on there, and then all of a sudden Mark Sanchez doesn't look any good. The Baltimore Ravens, when he was the offensive coordinator there, he helped them win the Super Bowl in 2000, but they had terrible quarterback play, and they were not able to advance any quarterbacks there. So I would have a lot of issues with that. Plus, I would look at the fact that Kirk Cousins, for the last 2 years, has had Deshaun Jackson and Pierre Garçon and Jamison Crowder and Jordan Reed and Vernon Davis. And when he goes to San Francisco, he'll have Bruce Ellington and Vance McDonald and, no support whatsoever. And it'll be ugly. And I think that the San Francisco 49ers, please trade 2 high draft picks for Kirk Cousins. Please give him $120 million. I don't think that Kirk Cousins is going to be the revered get of 2017. Not that he's as bad. He's not going to be, like you said, he's not going to be a Brock Osweiler situation, but he will cost more than Brock Osweiler. It'll be more guaranteed money. And if it's as big of a disaster as I think it'll be in 2017, they'll be having to look at 2020 or 2021 as the first year they can get away from Cousins. And that's where I think that he's in such a good situation right now that when he goes to such a terrible situation in San Francisco, it'll get ugly. Now, they've got $100 million so they can improve, and they can use, they can use those picks and the money to improve, but I could see how it could go poorly.
Can I just offer a slight counter to that then? I mean, sure. There's every chance it would be a disaster. 2 things. One, he would know the offense. There wouldn't be a major transition there, and he knows the head coach already. They have some in their offensive line. They still have Joe Staley. They spent a first-round pick on a guard a year ago. There's a potential to mold an offensive line which is at least serviceable there. And I don't think it was one of the worst in the league last year. They do have Carlos Hyde, a running back, who's not terrible. They do have the potential to go. They would need to some receiving targets. So would it be? It's fairly realistic to think that they might go after Pierre Garçon. If they got Kirk Cousins, for example, Garçon has been playing in Washington. He's a free agent. Could get him for $9 million, maybe. They could bring him in. Could they look at someone like Alshon Jeffrey, for example? Deshaun Jackson's going to be on the free agent market. There's actually 1 or 2 or 3 decent receiving options there that they could get to put around Kirk Cousins. And again, it's not ideal, but you give him a couple of. Vance McDonald has got potential, has always had potential, but has never realized that potential. But, Jordan Reed, in the way that he played in Washington, is there a chance that Kirk Cousins could really get the best out of Vance McDonald? If Carlos Hyde could stay healthy, if they draft another running back to pair with him, you're starting to get a semblance of an offense there. And it's really the cap room that's going to really benefit them more than anything. The fact that they can go out and add some pieces and play to the strength of free agency, which is possibly wide receiver. You're probably right. There's every chance there would be a disaster, but I think there's also, at least you could put a plan together there that would make some sense to get Cousins in an offense he knows with a receiver he knows in Garçon, that could cause at least a few teams some troubles. That wouldn't be a 10 or 11 win team, but it might be a team that wins 7, 8 games, which would be a major improvement based on what they were last season.
What's better? I'm curious too, what your thoughts would be. What would be better? Let's say that they had to give up their high second-round pick this year in order to acquire Cousins, but they did retain their first-round pick. What would be better? Kirk Cousins and Jonathan Allen, or they don't trade for Kirk Cousins, so they take Deshaun Watson and I don't know, Hassan Reddick, or then they use that high second-round pick on a different defensive player. Take your pick of who you think would be there that would be the best option, but what would be better, especially given and taking into account the 4 or 5 year rookie contract for Deshaun Watson.
Well, I think that the best thing that I like Deshaun Watson. I could make a case for taking him at 2, but I like Mitch Trubisky as well. I think they get hammered a bit too much in the media, but I think if you could get maybe for a 2018 conditional pick, which is maybe a second rounder if you win less than 4 games or less than 5 games, and a first rounder if you win more than that. Maybe that's an option they could do. Plus, give Washington the second round pick this year. Maybe that would be a kind of a deal that would Washington would go for. If it was just a 2 straight up, you could still get a really good player at I think they pick in the second round. I think that you can make a case for a lot of different things, but I think Shanahan is he wants to get stuck in here. I think he wants to get a quarterback that he knows, that he trusts, that he believes in, that knows his offense, that he could put out on week 1 and would have a grasp, who could lead this thing. That's the thing about a quarterback. You bring them in, you want them to lead. And I think that's part of what Kirk Cousins is one of his quibbles is in Washington, that he's never really truly been allowed to lead because the team's constantly been in, either tentative to give him the job, then they did give him the job, now they're not committing to him. And I think he wants to walk into a locker room and say, I'm the guy, it's me, this is my offense, this is my team, and I'm going to lead you guys. And I think that's kind of what Shanahan wants. I think he probably wants a quarterback who is his guy, who can be another coach for him in that dressing room.
Also, and I know we have no way of knowing this because John Lynch is completely brand new to the executive branch, but from what I understand, it sounds like, we know that John Lynch will have total personnel control. So, we have no way of knowing what that means because he's never made a move before. But do you think that he will be giving in to what Kyle Shanahan wants? And we know that Jed York doesn't necessarily have the smarts to pair people at those 2 positions that will get along. So do you think that John Lynch will even care what Kyle Shanahan thinks? And do you have any inclination into what maybe John Lynch even thinks that the best option at quarterback is?
Well, the implication seemed to be that Kyle Shanahan had control of the 53-man roster, that he was essentially being given, rightly or wrongly, the Pete Carroll, Josh McDaniels when he was in Denver style power, which is to sort of make the big decisions with the franchise. And San Francisco probably needed to do that with any head coach they were going to bring in because it's not the most attractive job. It's a major rebuild. So John Lynch, I think, is more of a figurehead. Is kind of somebody who is a class act. He knows the game. People respect him. And I think they were looking for someone who could bring a degree of respectability to that role. Someone who could just pull things together. Somebody who was going to be in there, 10 hours a day, working towards something, being the face of the management side of the franchise.
Well, let me just quickly, interject, because from what I understand, and I don't know the best way to interpret this. So John Lynch said that Shanahan will have final say on the 53-man roster, while John Lynch will control the off-season 90-man roster, free agency, and the draft. Quote, in all of those, it's also written that subject to approval of the other guy, a true partnership between the head coach and GM. That's the way we wanted it. That's the way we wanted it reflected. That's the reality of it. That's the way we started having these discussions. So, so I don't know what that means. Shanahan will have final say on the 53-man roster, while Lynch will control the offseason 90-man roster and free agency and the draft. To me, that sounds like Lynch will put together the 90-man roster. do the free agency, do the draft, and Shanahan will get to make his cuts in any way that he sees possible, and all that stuff after the fact. I don't know if that do you interpret it that way?
I mean, they can say what they want. I mean, the idea that Kyle Shanahan, with his reputation that he had at Atlanta this year, helping them produce the 8th best offense in NFL history, the idea that he would be ceding control on the big decisions on the roster to John Lynch, who has never been a GM before and has never worked in an NFL front office, I just find very unlikely. So I think it probably is a partnership in the way that Pete Carroll and John Schneider is a partnership, and Pete Carroll has the ultimate final say. So I think if Kyle Shanahan turns to John Lynch and says, I want Kirk Cousins, I think they will, and we need to do what it takes to get Kirk Cousins, then I think they will do what it takes to get Kirk Cousins. It's really gonna, I think Kyle will dictate the moves that they do, and John Lynch is gonna be, like I said, I mean, he will have his input, he will have his opinions, he will have his thoughts, he will no doubt be doing what he can to support and interject, but I think that Kyle Shanahan's gonna probably be making most of the big personnel decisions.
All right. Well, that concludes this episode of 3000 NFL Mock Draft. It's been a very enlightening, I think, episode, and good stuff to talk about ahead of the combine, ahead of some free agent moves, ahead of potentially a Kirk Cousins move. And by the time we come back next week, the combine stuff will be out of the way. Once the combine stuff is out of the way, we'll have more idea of the players the Seahawks could be targeting. All the 32 teams will have ideas of who they'll be targeting. And then we'll be, edging on that March 9th opening of the free agency period, and then shit's going to go crazy. So, much different world we are entering within the next few weeks. And by the time you come back next week, we'll have a whole bunch of stuff to talk about in regards to the combine. Follow Rob on Twitter at Rob Staten. Go to SeahawksDraftBlog.com. fieldgoals.com. If you want to listen to the podcast feed on the RSS feed of this, I think it's under Seaside Chats with Kenneth Arthur. Sorry for all the confusion, but technically and technologically, I could use some advancement in my life. So thank you for listening to 3000 NFL Mock Draft. This has been this edition of the show. Tune in next week for a brand new draft.